evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on ASEAN's answer to the Myanmar crisis. My name is Tan Hui, and I'm the Indo-China Bureau Chief of the Straits Times and a board member of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. And I'm your moderator for tonight. Now, due to the COVID situation, this is a fully online panel discussion. It's being broadcast live on Facebook and YouTube, and also screened live at the FCCT. The club's restaurant is still operating until 9 p.m. on weekdays. So if you're watching this from the FCCT, thank you for your support. Tonight's event is part of a series of discussions we have been running on the crisis in Myanmar. For a brief introduction, this is what has taken place since Myanmar's military, or the Tatmadaw, seized power on the 1st of February. At least 753 people have been killed by the regime. Over 3,400 people have been detained. Mobile internet has been cut nationwide. Thousands of villages displaced. Dissidents and journalists have been forced to flee across the border. Now, ASEAN as a regional bloc, which Myanmar belongs to, is constrained by its policy of non-interference, but it has been under tremendous pressure to act because Myanmar's crisis could become a major source of regional instability and affect its interaction with major powers. Last Saturday, ASEAN's leaders gathered in Jakarta together with Myanmar's military chief, Min Aung Hlaing, for a special summit. We can discuss more about whether it was appropriate to invite him. But they essentially reached a 5-point consensus to cease violence, to hold a constructive dialogue among all parties concerned, to have a special envoy facilitate this dialogue, to have ASEAN provide humanitarian aid, and to have the special envoy and an ASEAN delegation to go to Myanmar to meet all the parties concerned. Now, what does this consensus mean, and what will ASEAN need to do next? Can ASEAN be an effective platform to help bring about a resolution in Myanmar? Or will it, as some critics say, continue to be passive and toothless? For tonight, we have gathered some experts who can go beyond the usual rhetoric and give some deeper insight into what's at play and what we might see ASEAN doing in the next few weeks as it tries to live up to its 5-point consensus. Tonight we have Mr. Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Mr. Ong is also a former Secretary General of ASEAN. Next, we have Dr. Prapi Apichatsakul, an Assistant Professor at Sinagrani Europe University and Vice President of the American Studies Association in Thailand. We have Mr. Kavi Chongkitawon, a veteran journalist and senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies, Chulalongkorn University. Finally, we have Dr. Marty Natalegawa, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now to our viewers out there, if you have any questions at any point in time for our panelists, please write them in the comment section of the Facebook video, and please also state your name and affiliation, and we will be sure to pick them up. Now, on to our discussion. Let's start with Mr. Ong. Mr. Ong, you were the ASEAN Secretary General some years after Myanmar joined ASEAN, and you had to manage Western countries that were reluctant to deal with ASEAN as a result. Could you share with us what you think about ASEAN's initiatives this time around?
Well, thank you. I wanted to remind ourselves that ASEAN is a 10-member country organization, and there is a lot of diversity in the way the member countries' political, economic, and social structure and policies are organized. So far, I think there is general agreement with all the ASEAN officials that the situation in Myanmar require a quick kind of management. Yeah, that is a bureaucratic language where we use. We always have to manage something in the ASEAN setup. But this time around, I think the urgency is keenly felt, not only because so many violent activities had happened and many casualties had also been inflicted on the civilian population, but because there are many things happening outside of Myanmar, outside of the ASEAN region, and there is the need for us to try to ensure that Southeast Asia does not become embroiled in all these kind of issues that affect what we call the international order, the relationship among all the big powers in the world, and so on and so forth. All these have an impact on Southeast Asia. And on top of that, we have this thing called the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can see in the daily news, this situation is going through many different permutation and waves after waves of infections require all of us to pay extra attention and try to look for a quick cooperative framework to tackle or at least to contain the COVID-19 spread. So this time around, what the ASEAN leaders have done is to try to organize themselves to reach some basic, what I call baseline. And all of you have followed the proceedings on Saturday. The ASEAN leaders met at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, in Indonesia. And we can discuss about all the outcome emerging from that gathering. But what I thought is important is that, number one, the situation is quite dire due to the casualties and damage done to the Myanmar people and the Myanmar society. Number two, there is a raging COVID-19 pandemic, which restrict a lot of normal diplomatic activities as well as traveling by the ordinary people across our region. And number three, the international situation is not in the most positive of what we call health. Yeah. So the good thing was, despite all these things, the leaders all came together. Three countries leaders were not able to attend, but they sent their ministerial representatives. So they came out with a what I call rather positive plan. Yeah, and many people talk about a 5-point consensus. Yeah, for the sake of our audience out there, maybe just for me to repeat and quickly the 5 points: stop violence. Yeah, resume dialogue among all stakeholders. Yeah, allow ASEAN to play a constructive role, facilitate a visit by an ASEAN delegation, and number 5, facilitate humanitarian assistance led by ASEAN as well as other involved parties. Yeah, so this came out in the what we call chairman statement. It is a specific piece of paper with these 5 points there. We can discuss some of these details as we go on to this panel discussion. So for me, I think this is an initial step. Yeah. There is a long process ahead of us, but obviously, I hope that the first thing we hope to have stoppage of the violence, and people can start engaging each other in dialogue. Unfortunately, this did not seem to be the case because, at least here in Singapore, we have read the report just now. Some protesters were fired upon, and a few of them might have been killed. Yeah, and so this is something that we need to watch very carefully. The immediate action that we are expecting from this gathering of leaders is that the ASEAN Secretary General, he is going to organize a group of people together to visit Myanmar as soon as possible. And hopefully the conversation or the engagement over on the ground there in Myanmar will be a further positive steps towards what the leaders are expecting. But the leaders have all assured each other that they are committed to manage this situation and try to find a solution to it. However, they all know that it is not going to be a straightforward, quick journey. I will stop here for the time being to let the others have their say.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, like, I agree. It's not going to be a short or straightforward journey. Well, let's move on to Dr. Prapi. Dr. Prapi, you have written about the principle of responsibility to protect. Is that relevant in any way to this discussion on Myanmar, and in particular to ASEAN's role? What are your thoughts? Yeah, you muted your microphone. She needs to unmute her microphone. All right.
So can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. Yeah, you
Okay.
muted yourself
Okay.
just now.
I'm sorry.
Let's
Let's
start from the beginning here.
Okay. Good evening.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very honored to be on this panel discussion and to have the opportunity to speak with such high level colleagues. Thank you for FCCT for organizing this event. This is my first time to be here, and first of all, I would like to mention that several weeks ago, before the ASEAN summit, the organizer had invited me to talk about R2P. There are many questions today following the ASEAN summit on Myanmar last Saturday regarding to the 5-point consensus. So this evening I will try to apply my knowledge about international law and R2P norm to the Myanmar crisis to the best of my ability. I'm going to show you my PowerPoint. So everybody knows at this point that summit results in 5-point consensus. Everyone say and content say already about the 5-point is about to stop violence and set up a constructive dialogue among parties. To provide an special envoy and provide a humanitarian assistance and also the special delegation will visit Myanmar and conclude this matter. Okay. So for me, my observation to this 5-point consensus, I think 5-point consensus, we can see that second. I'm sorry about this. It still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Oh, okay. The 5-point consensus is a good solution, but I'm concerned about the time frame and there's still no specific detailed plan. So I'm worried that I'm also concerned about this is like maybe it's just like a maybe it's because of other nations try to put the pressures on ASEAN to solve this problem. So ASEAN try to this is the way that ASEAN try to decrease the pressure from the international communities, and maybe I'm worried it's about like a lip service, but maybe I'm not sure about that. That can they will fail to solve the problem or not. So this is from my observation. And so next slide, I will show you. Okay, so maybe there will be the question about the obligation. So what's next? The ASEAN's member obligation in this crisis. So actually, in the Article 5, Article 5 of ASEAN Charter, ASEAN member states have to commit themselves to comply with the collective provisions in the agreement. So let me explain to you more. See, and also about the consensus. The consensus, let me explain to you about the Article 20, subsection 1. The ASEAN member must follow the outcome of the consensus and apply the situation. So now, how may they do that? To do that, well, there's a number of ways, such as the bilateral negotiation, private talks. They could apply pressure with the political difference, or perhaps even apply sanctions. So we move to the question that so how the international law applies this if the anti-coup protester will still call for outside intervention. The non-intervention is the core value in sovereignty, and that means nation state cannot interfere. And also the UN Charter Article 2, subsection 4 state that the use of force violates international law, except the case of self-defense. However, the current invitations of anti-coup protesters to the outsider to help solve this problem, we can call it like the intervention by invitations, and this will lead the way to the norm we call responsibility to protect, or we say that it's R2P. Okay, so what's this R2P? What is R2P? The responsibility to protect is an international norm, and a commitment to stop genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The move to this slide. Okay, so the main concept of R2P is that every nation in the world must protect their people from this crime, and to all nations in the world must encourage and assist other nations to meet that responsibility. And the last one is when the nation fail to protect its population, military interventions is possible, but only if authorized by the UN Security Council. So let me show you this slide. Okay, so you will see from this slide that R2P related in many ways, and many things here, a lot. In my opinion, right now, R2P can be good things, but when it direct help the people, but we have to be mindful with the R2P, because it can lead to be a negative outcome such as use of force, and that I showed on the screen, use of force or an exploitation when by outside nation. In Myanmar case, R2P for me in my case, I think R2P is not appropriate. It may prolong this process, and it's based in Western ideal, which might allow the other nations to take advantage of this situation. I think I still think that the ASEAN is a base organization for solve the crisis in Myanmar, because ASEAN and its members have a closer connection and deeper understanding of Myanmar. That is my presentation. Thank you for listening to what I had to say today about the situation. And I hope you can find it useful as we move forward. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Prapi. Just a reminder to all, if you're watching this at home and would like to pose a question, please write them in the comment section of our Facebook Live video. Now let's move on to Kun Kobi. Now, Kun Kobi, you've always had your ear very close to the ground when it comes to all matters of ASEAN. So, what do you think we can expect here after the summit?
Well, I expect a lot out of summit 3 days ago. First of all, I was kind of very happy that ASEAN got together and come up with 5-point, I would say 5-point roadmap. Yes, it's a consensus. It's a step by step. It's just like playing music, do, re, mi, fa, sol. And the pitch will going higher after this 5 points has been attained. And I think also the junta leader also has shown some commitment as a member of ASEAN family. In the past 72 hours, the violence inside the country has been reduced, but it's not totally. I think this is something that we still need to work on. And I think pressure from ASEAN must continue. Meanwhile, to make sure that things will proceed quickly and also in tangible way, ASEAN's must first of all decide on the formula, whether we will have what sort of ASEAN envoy we will have. So I think after we have an ASEAN envoy, then we can proceed with the next step of having some the team going inside Myanmar to scoop for information, assess the situation both on the ground and for humanitarian. And I think this is very good development, because it's put ASEAN again in the driver's seat. And this time I noticed something that the international community is member of the United Nations Security Council really trust ASEAN to handle this regional issue. And I think in the end, ASEAN will prove that ASEAN can do the job, but it will take some time. And also, one point that is very interesting in the chairman's statement, which I think Ambassador Ong Keng Yong has mentioned, is the external environment, which has created a lot of uncertainty whether ASEAN as a regional organization can handle this crisis without outside intervention. Now it is clear that ASEAN has come forward and addressed the issue of US-China rivalry at its direct impact on whatever peace and stability within the region. That explains why I was so surprised that the chairman's statement would put this thing on urging ASEAN foreign minister to meet as soon as possible with counterpart from the US and China to make sure that ASEAN will handle this regional issue and want to make sure that their support are very important. And luckily so, I think China and other countries have expressed full support of their ASEAN's 5-point consensus. So we have to be patient because ASEAN, when ASEAN make a commitment, unlike any other organization, ASEAN cannot retract. ASEAN has been with, for example, Thailand for 13 solid years during the Cambodian conflict. And now with the Myanmar crisis, it will take some time. So we need to watch carefully ASEAN move, and of course, Myanmar people also have to understand the limitations that member ASEAN country has. As Ong Keng Yong has pointed out, we are a very diverse group, just like Disneylands of a political system or world political system contained in ASEAN grouping. So I'm confident that ASEAN can handle a Myanmar crisis because ASEAN has been able to handle many crises before. Luckily, this time it has a good start, a little bit delayed because of the timing of other issue, the COVID-19 and all that. So when I'm looking forward, I hope that both the military junta and ASEAN will closely work together, and hopefully all stakeholders will sooner or later will come onto the negotiating table, realizing that in order to fulfill the Myanmar people's view, you have to start dialogue and looking forward. And one thing is also very positive. I think international community are very supportive of ASEAN. For example, I heard that Australia has already committed $5 million to help with the whatever plan that ASEAN has to do with the humanitarian system. So I'm pretty optimistic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kankami. That was a really positive outlook that you gave. And now let's move on to Dr. Marty. Now, Dr. Marty, you've always been a very passionate advocate for ASEAN and its higher ideals, if I may say. Has the recent ASEAN consensus been up to your expectations, and what does ASEAN need to do next?
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation, and wonderful to be amongst colleagues again. I mean, the ASEAN summit recently convened and concluded is a significant and important event. To me, first and foremost, as far as internal ASEAN dynamic is concerned, at least it put to rest any hesitation or any confusing messages that initially came out, whether ASEAN should engage on the Myanmar issue or development. Because as a matter of fact, over these past years and decades even, ASEAN has been engaged on Myanmar throughout its reform process, and therefore it was rather surprising in some ways when the coup occurred. There was some initial going back and forth and hesitation and mixed messages among ASEAN member states whether it should or shouldn't engage on Myanmar. At least with the summit, at the very least, now there is no going back. ASEAN is out there engaging and publicly committing itself to be part of the solution to the developments in Myanmar. And all the usual question marks, whether this is in violation of principle of non-interference or the reality of the different political systems that ASEAN member states have. I think they are, in a way, important facts, but since ASEAN is now meant to be a community, and there are actually commitments that all ASEAN member states, as sovereign states, have made through the ASEAN Charter, through the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, etc. So even though it is not impossible to, on the one hand, promote, protect democratic principles, and at the same time be respectful of the principle of non-interference. But in any case, as I said, those are now have fortunately behind us. Now, through the summit, ASEAN has demonstrated and publicly put it out there, they are engaged, and there's no turning back. We can't have piecemeal or a la carte regionalism. You cannot suddenly have individual ASEAN member states backtracking from their summit level commitments made on Saturday. And I think the second point, the summit is important because it sort of sets the scene or reinforces the message that ultimately the crisis in Myanmar must be resolved in peaceful means, through dialogue, through diplomacy, through dialogue among the stakeholders. All of us are so familiar with other conflict situations in other parts of the world. You think of places like Syria, Libya, and others, where years and on end we see delay in finding political solution, and as a result, the victims and those who suffer as a result are the ordinary citizens and peoples of those countries involved. And therefore, I think without delay, as a result of the ASEAN summit, following the ASEAN summit, not only are we reinforcing the message of ASEAN being engaged, we should also be reinforcing the message that this is a problem that requires political solution, dialogue, diplomacy. And ASEAN deserves support in those efforts. It is not going to be an easy task. Others have mentioned the consensus, the 5-point consensus. There are, as others have said, important points. To me, most of all, the 5-point consensus is important because it sets a benchmark of progress or lack of progress. Henceforth, it's notwithstanding its obvious, there's always scope and room for improvement, but the 5 points are important points, and now we can measure progress against those 5 points. For instance, the first point to do with the cessation of violence. Since Saturday, if I'm not mistaken, we have seen continued perpetration of violence by the junta against demonstrators, peacefully expressing their views. Having made that commitment on Saturday, now such acts are even more abhorrent, even more unacceptable, because commitments have been made before all ASEAN leaders. So in other words, the 5 points to me are extremely important because it sets the bar, it sets the benchmark against which to measure or to monitor and to report and to verify compliance. I am not especially encumbered by the notion of delegation going back and forth. Those are means to an end. Rather than being focused on, we can take things one step at a time. For instance, ASEAN member states, all of them have embassies in Yangon, Naypyidaw. Why don't the 9 member states of ASEAN, through their existing embassies, constitute themselves as some kind of a coordinated role to measure and to report and to verify developments based on the 5 points on the ground? So in other words, therefore, we should be looking at things that can be done here and now, rather than simply, trying to be procedurally correct. Of course, having a special envoy, having the delegation of ASEAN to Myanmar would be a test of the goodwill of the junta. But there are other things that ASEAN member states can do now post-summit. We have the benchmark, we have the criterion against which to measure progress. But, in my initial remarks, I wanted to mention just one thing, if I may, just as a concluding remarks before we open the discussion. I think is especially important, and I thought I haven't heard it just now expressed, especially important for ASEAN to be seen, not only to be doing, but to be seen, to be engaged with the national unity government, with the civil disobedience, national unity government, and the civil disobedience movement, and other stakeholders. Because a dialogue must be inclusive in nature. Well, I get the point that, of course, at the initial stage at the summit just now, without conferring recognition, ASEAN must deliver the message directly to the junta, so that there can be no mistake in sensing the mood within ASEAN. But I think in the days to come, not weeks, in the days to come, in my view, ASEAN member states, either individually or even better collectively, or the chair, must be seen to be engaging the stakeholders, other stakeholders, the democratic forces. Otherwise, the credibility of the process that ASEAN had just launched may be gradually be eroded. Hence, extremely important not only to be engaging the junta, but to be demonstratively, deliberately, publicly engaging the democratic forces. There is no level playing field. I have to be extremely clear about that. The junta came to power. They seized power by bullets, by guns. We have at the opposite ends leaders who are democratically elected through the ballot boxes. So there cannot be moral equivalence. Hence, in my view, ASEAN, with all, what a tremendous achievement, development that ASEAN made possible through the summit, thanks to the hard work of all concerned, including the foreign minister of Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and others have worked tirelessly. And it's great that they have had the summit, but it is, as they have themselves said, this is the beginning of a process. But now it's out there. We shouldn't let the junta to wiggle themselves out of this commitment, because I've read in the past several hours some kind of trying to water down or qualifying their commitments to consensus they had reached or they had been part of. And therefore, I think there must be now corresponding reaching out to the national unity government, the civil disobedience movement, and other stakeholders. So there is a semblance of dialogue, reaching out to all concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marty. Now that you mentioned the watering down of what was agreed during the ASEAN leaders meeting, I thought it might be helpful if I read out this portion of the press release issued by the junta, the State Administration Council, on the ASEAN leaders meeting. Now let me pull up this portion. Myanmar informed the meeting that it will give careful consideration to constructive suggestions made by ASEAN leaders when the situation returns to stability in the country, since priorities at the moment were to maintain law and order and to restore community peace and tranquility. In this regard, Myanmar also informed the meeting that the suggestions would be positively considered if it would facilitate the implementation of the 5-step roadmap laid down by the State Administration Council, serves the interests of the country, and was based on the purposes and principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter, ASEAN Way, and ASEAN Spirit. So that's a whole lot of qualifiers there that raises questions about the kind of commitment that the State Administration Council would have to the 5-point consensus that was sealed over the weekend. So maybe let this be the first question that I will pose to all panelists. What do you think of this kind of statement coming out from the junta? What does it say about the kind of commitment that it has to what was agreed over the weekend. Anybody like to begin?
Well, yeah, I think while the commentaries and the qualifiers are coming out, the fact of the matter is that we are really, according to the ASEAN mode of operation, a particular document. And at that point in time, none other than the head of the Tamado was in a meeting with our other ASEAN leaders. Yeah. The important thing now is that words can be put out to explain certain things, to try to qualify certain things, but the necessary action on the ASEAN side will proceed. Yeah. So for me, I do not want to be distracted by all these statements and qualifiers, but hoping that our Secretary General of ASEAN and the rest of the ASEAN member states who have agreed to this approach will quickly organize the next step, get on with the work. Yeah. So I will not put too much into these statements and other things that come into the way. Yeah. Let's get on with the work. And if we move to the next stage where action is being implemented and according to our 5-point consensus and the military authorities on the ground in Myanmar refuse to follow, then we will have a serious problem. But right now, I think let's give the process a chance. Yeah. The important thing now is, as I said just now, the action against the protesters should be minimized, especially if they are peaceful protests on the streets. Yeah. The use of lethal force was condemned by all our ASEAN leaders, every one of them. Yeah. If you look at the plead by all our ASEAN leaders, it is not to aggravate the situation. So let us hope that yes, we take account of these statements coming out, but I will not lose hope because they are new qualifier and whatnot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to address the question? Tori. Yes.
Well,
Oh,
okay. But please first,
maybe
can
Kun
go
go
ahead.
first, yeah.
Okay,
So,
so I agree with him. So it's time for actions, and well, he's saying less words than statement, but we must follow through in the resolution reached in the summit now. Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Well, I hate to say this. If you read the document by Tatmadaw, this is the way it always responds to whatever commitment it has. This is not the first time it has coming out with all qualifiers. I think the only indication would be action on the ground, on the street. Certainly, like but Marty has said that in the past 72 hours, even though the violence has been lessened, it's not completely absent. So I think it will take time, but if in the next days and weeks and some of this consensus were not totally implemented, then I think ASEAN will have to think of other measure. But for the time being, is rest on us that we have to move on with the plan. And I think this is why setting up ASEAN envoy. And the point that Marty mentions, the dialogue with all stakeholders, with the NUG, is very important. And I think ASEAN already has informal approach with some of the key members.
Thank
Just
you.
very quickly, Huye, if I may, I agree with the points other colleagues have mentioned before, and especially one recognizes diplomacy or mediation is a process. It's not an event. One can't expect out of a 2 or 3 hours meeting, a summit, suddenly there is a day and night change and then everything becomes all solved. There will be vacillations, there will be ups and downs, and there will be confusing signals and etc. That the mediator or the parties that are trying to resolve the issue must be able to decipher the intent, the true intent of the party concerned. But this is a time when trust needs to be built, trust in one another's goodwill to carry through. But the point that I said before at the beginning is still, to me, valid in the sense that now ASEAN has a script thanks to the summit. Now ASEAN has those 5-point principles, which is very useful as a benchmark to measure on a day in and day out basis to what extent they are being implemented. And it seems to me quite fair as well that the 5-point principles must be communicated and explained and shared properly, publicly, with the national unity government and the other stakeholders. Otherwise, there has to be, as Foreign Minister of Indonesia had mentioned before, if I'm not mistaken, a Myanmar-owned and Myanmar-led process, and such a process must be inclusive in nature. And Pa Ong Keng Yong would be familiar with the experience past. We've had so many UN envoys on Myanmar, and I remember many occasions in the past that it was a little bit of a paradox that Myanmar would be open to the idea of having UN envoys come to Yangon, but when it comes to ASEAN delegations, they would be a bit more hesitant. They would say that this is an internal matter, etc. And so it was a bit an ironic and a paradoxical situation. But sometimes we can just press on, as Pa Ong Keng Yong I guess suggests, and just move forward. Because I remember in 2011, I went as a Foreign Minister of Indonesia to Myanmar to speak with all the different democratic stakeholders when the idea of Myanmar chairing ASEAN was being mooted. I didn't wait for some document to say that it's agreed that you should visit. I just turn up. Likewise, in 2012, when the Rakhine situation developed, we just turn up to deal with the issue. In other words, yes, it is a process. There will be conflicting signals. We must have perseverance, resilience, and commitment, and wage the peace. But the point again that I wanted to underscore is that there must be a reaching out to the democratically elected forces in Myanmar. That is just, to me, is obvious point. Thank you.
Thank
On
you.
that note,
Well, let's move on to... Yes, please.
On that note, I wanted to just add that if you read all the words coming up from the ASEAN summit in Jakarta on Saturday, the consistent line is that our ASEAN leaders expressed the need to engage all the parties involved.
Yeah.
You know, and some media reports suggested that his leader of the Commodore should not be there because he does not represent the people of Myanmar. However, I think our leaders' approach is to say that all the stakeholders, whether Commodore, whether democratically elected politicians, people of Myanmar, all of them must be engaged. So I think let's give some credence to the leaders. They are political leaders in our 10 countries. I think they'll be happy with being snooped by any of statements or action anybody else would want to put it off, So important thing is, one, there is going to be a dialogue. The dialogue must be credible. Cannot be just a dialogue between ASEAN member state and the Tamadol. And what's the purpose? Yeah. So this is something that I think we uh, watch and observe in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Great. So the general message is to be patient and look for the action instead of what's being said, right?
Yeah, but not patient
Okay, so
to
now
the
we move
extent that
on.
patient to the extent that there is a further delay. Yeah, we have to follow the thing systematically, just moving. Yeah,
Yes.
and we don't want to say the thing is over. Let's wait 3 days to the X or Y. No. So keep the ball rolling, as we say.
Yeah.
Yes. We will move on to the question from our viewers. The first question we have is from Rachakit. There's a lot of interest in this special envoy that ASEAN is going to appoint. So the question is there any person in mind you think who you think possible to be appointed as ASEAN special envoy? What kind of properties must this person have? And should the person be from the chair of Brunei or not? I guess this person means should this special envoy be someone nominated by Brunei? What do you think?
Well, but Marty had been a foreign minister before. He knows the part of being a special envoy. Yeah, my experience was being a secretary general to the political leader. My own view is that it doesn't matter who is the person, as long as that person has the mandate. Yeah, the mandate. And we must not forget the responsibility of the Secretary General. The Secretary General of ASEAN is a Secretary General, but he is more Secretary than General. He has to take the lead from the leaders, and now he has this 5-point thing in his hand, and he will have to facilitate the actual appointment of the special envoy. Yeah, the chair of ASEAN today is Brunei. Therefore, Brunei will have to crack on it very quickly. Yeah, and then the Secretary General, according to ASEAN Charter and all that, will have to provide all the necessary resources and whatever logistic requirement to execute the first of the plan. Yeah, so I think it is not necessary to really agonize over who is the guy, what kind of qualification he has. We can even appoint Kavi as the special envoy here, as long as he has the mandate. Yeah, as long as he's a mandate, the Secretary General is required to support Kavi. Yeah. So what is necessary is to have the confidence that whoever appointed to this role will carry out according to the decision of the leaders. Yeah. And in this respect, as Pak Mati and the rest of us have stressed, important to have the envoy engaging all those stakeholders in Myanmar. He cannot just go and just say hello to Tamado and meet a few people on state TV and that's about it. No. I think it's very clear. Yeah. So I would say that who is going to be envoy is not important. Then what is the mandate and the clarity about what he has to do?
Can I have a crack
What
on
about
it?
the qualities of this person? I know you mentioned this about mandate, but what about the qualities of this person? What must this
Well,
person
first of all, he has to be brave
be
enough
like?
to go to Myanmar. Yeah. Don't forget, Myanmar is in
This
the
person will
middle
be
of
well protected.
yeah. Well, you can protect against the tamado, but what about the virus and other kind of invisible threat? So I think it is something that we have to think about, but they don't have much time. They have to do it quickly. Yeah. Of course, in case I think the ASEAN leaders have basically, according to ASEAN mode of operation, uh, has entrusted it to the Secretary General to follow up. Yeah, but the ASEAN chair is Brunei, and it has to be the guy that make the first move. I wish to appoint Kavi Chongkitawong to be the envoy, and then Secretary General Lim Chok Hoi will have to talk to Mr. Kavi. When you want to go? How are you going to do it? Blah blah blah. So I think this is something of a pleasure, but pressure is exerted on the chair. The currently is Brunei, yeah, but they have done a good job bringing together all the ASEAN for the ASEAN leaders for the summit, and I think they are not going to rest there. They want to finish the task before them.
Yeah, I just can I add to what Ambassador Ong Keng Yong has said? The Thai has proposed the formula friend of the chair, realizing that chairman has a lot of tasks, numerous responsibility, and would like to propose this idea so that friend of the chair, as a chair, can appoint in the team. Of course, you will have ASEAN envoy, you will have Secretary General, and somebody else that will come in to help monitoring the situation on the ground and also handling the humanitarian and other things. I think Secretary General or the chairs probably is looking into all this possibility. And also, ASEAN also has a formula of Troika that have been quite useful in the past. And of course, the role of Secretary General and its office has been quite important during the crisis, Nakis. So I think when you put all the three together, you can have a real picture as to how ASEAN will proceed as a team with individual person doing certain tasks.
Can I add something? I agree with Kun Gawi because of the our ASEAN charter. Now they give the secretary general more power to engage, and also I think not only the special envoy, but um, he must show the potential to this crisis that okay keep watching the in this process. So I think the general secretary is like a key person. Okay, thank you.
If I may, I agree with what others have said before on in response to the question. I'm less preoccupied with the person, but rather more in terms of the conducive environment which would allow or not allow that said person, she or he, as an envoy, to be able to carry out his or her work. I think just now, Paung Keng Yong mentioned about the importance of a clear mandate, for instance, that will be extremely important so that the person concerned would be able to have the requisite mandate and understanding of what is the task being set for her or him. At the same time, I think this is a situation where less can be more as well. I mean, we really don't know how the different permutations will find its resolution, really, because this supposed envoy is supposed to mediate, if I'm not mistaken, in the words of the consensus between the different parties in Myanmar, and therefore he or she must be given plenty of room to be able to find convergences and identifying differences is pretty simple, but identifying convergences is not as easy. It will be extremely difficult enough to have to bring together the different parties in Myanmar if at the same time you have to watch out or to be encumbered by too straight-jacketed approach. So I think there has to be a degree of flexibility for the special envoy, for her, or for him to be able to, to identify the contour of the situation, where the convergences are, and basically to test ideas. I think this is the beauty of having a special envoy. Whatever idea that being proposed will be essentially his or her idea. Leaders, the Myanmar parties may accept it, may reject it, but it's not like a high stakes, immediately leaders level, immediately formal ministerial level. So it is. That's why I think yes, clarity of mandate is important, etc., etc. Logistical support, of course, but at the same time, here I think is where simplicity can actually help as well, because this person's main task, I believe, will be to listen first and foremost, because they have to listen. There's no magic wand, really. I mean, who they have to be able to listen to the wishes and demands of the different sides, which is through what is their intent and their position, their concern, and to identify convergences. And in this task, this is a very thankless task. This person cannot be second guessed. Each time along the way. This is where I think informality becomes especially important. Nowadays diplomacy is so 24/7 under the watchful eyes and glare of every little step that one takes. This is where I think, and ASEAN has been very good at this, actually, Pak Ongkenyo, if I'm not mistaken, Kun Kavi and Dr. Prapi. When you think of all the various achievements as ASEAN achieved in the past, a lot of it was done informally, where ASEAN's informality and approach is actually, it was its strength. So, but my last point on not the person, on the condition, I think the trust of all the parties concerned. Of course, the trust and confidence of the chair of ASEAN, of the rest of ASEAN, but first and foremost, the trust and confidence of the stakeholders in Myanmar. Someone, ASEAN may come up with anyone that they wish, they think who's super competent, but if that person is not well received in Myanmar itself by one of the parties or some of the parties, then it becomes a moot point. So first and foremost, trust and confidence, comfort level, very important. And we have a chair in Brunei who is extremely well invested and well experienced, and leaders of ASEAN that have demonstrated leadership in recent days. And I'm confident that this will be important roadmap ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's an incredible amount of pressure on that one person. Well, the next question we have is from Phil Sherwell of the Sunday Times. It's half comment and half question directed at Kun Kavi. How can Kun Kavi conclude that ASEAN is in the driving seat and that he's so optimistic when, following Min Aung Hlaing's return to Myanmar, the junta has said that it only considers the consensus proposals as suggestions to be considered if they fit with the Tamadros roadmap, and only after they have stabilized the country, however, they choose to define that. That's a sharp and immediate rebuff from the generals to ASEAN. Never mind that the summit did not involve the country's elected politicians. I guess we talked about that a little before, but if you want to add a bit more to in response to
thank you.
question.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm looking at ASEAN and it works in a long haul. Of course, I wish that after the meeting on Saturday, that all violence stop immediately, just like Harry Potter movie. But in reality, that could not happen. It has to be a gradual praised sort of reduce of violence. For me, in the past 3 days, if I have to give a mark, it's like C. It should be plus, but it still could not attain. And I hope that in days to come, there should be a better situation on the ground. And I think this is important because when ASEAN is in the driver's seat, it's not only one country. We have 10 countries, including the junta. So we take time, we sit on the seat, we drive, and then somebody else will come in also. We change, rotate it. That is the beauty of ASEAN. So I'm still very determined in believing that ASEAN could handle this. And eventually, for the survival of Myanmar and also the futures, the Tatmadaw has to rely on ASEAN assistance in all dimensions. It will take time, but this thing will come together. It will take time. And I think the span will be around 5 months until the next 76th United Nations General Assembly, which will start in mid-September. So these 5 months will show whether ASEAN is relevant or not to all these issues within the region, whether we can really move on, ASEAN centralities and all that. But again, I'm confident that we can proceed and move ahead. Yes.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Thompson Chow. Thank you for your contribution. Some of the speakers mentioned the limitations of ASEAN's room for maneuvering regarding the Myanmar coup. Protesters in Myanmar are pretty angry at ASEAN for not demanding Min Aung Hlaing to transfer power to a democratic and civilian government. Is ASEAN unwilling or unable to publicly pressure the Myanmar junta to revert some form of democracy? Is suspension of ASEAN membership or other forms of political or economic punishment on the table if the junta continues its crackdown and clings on to power? Would anyone like to address that?
Okay, let me start by saying something. Yeah, well, it's always easy to look at certain conventional formula. When something happens and people are not happy with the outcome, the demand is for certain solution. Yeah, you know, this discussion so far indicated to me one very important point that our ASEAN leaders have done, which no newspaper up to now has actually studied this carefully. Min Aung Hlaing may be regarded as the leader of Tatmadaw. When he returned home, he has to face the other generals. We assume that he is in complete control, right? So, is that the case? Are we sure? And if you look at the events of the past 2.5 months, in Myanmar, all the ethnic groups are now activated. And each of these regions, each of these divisions, as the structure of the country is described, they are under different commander, right? There is no guarantee that everyone who wear 1 pip to 2 pip to 3 pip as general will agree with whatever Min Aung Hlaing has been agreeing to in Jakarta. So I think my response to this particular question is that, yeah, we think we have a way forward. There's no guarantee that the ASEAN maneuvers will yield any fruits. But is there any other choice? Is there any other choice? Many of the media people claim that ASEAN is toothless and this and that. Okay, so what other choice is there? Is the UN prepared to move in its forces? Is there a UN initiative to bring in peacekeepers? Who is going to pay for it? Number two, if you look at the geography of Myanmar, everybody who has the hard power, they are worried that the other guy with the better hard power will move in. So this is the thing that troubles me, because when we look at this, we just assume that everything must be formulated the way we play our own chess game. But there are many, many factors. So I want to say that our approach is that this is the thing on the table. We do not know what other countries and what other parties can do. But are they willing to do that in the first? Nobody has done anything. Everybody just pat our back and say, hey, ASEAN, go and find a solution. In other words, they are saying, I'm not getting involved. You find your own solution. Because my domestic opinion in the United States of America, in European Union countries, even in China, is, hey, don't inflict more damage on our property, on our political brownie points and what have you. So I hope that all our thinkers out there who are alert enough to think about all these questions will think about this. We are not saying that the ASEAN way is the best way going forward. We are just trying. And many people have forgotten one very basic point. Kavi always mentioned this to me. The longest serving ASEAN leader in the same job since 30 years ago, the only one is the Sultan of Brunei, who is also the foreign minister, the defense minister, and the finance minister. Who else has the kind of staying power and broad mandate? Yeah. So, clever of all our other ASEAN leaders to rally around the Brunei diplomacy. Okay, yeah, we better get the pressure off our back. And Your Majesty, you have been in the ASEAN summit from the beginning. Yeah. So try to lead us to go there. So I feel that we should give the ASEAN guys a chance, yeah, and stop trying to find all kind of reason to devalue the work of the ASEAN diplomatic move, yeah, and we can say that maybe the Brunei leadership or chairmanship may falter because the people or the general in Myanmar will play us out. Okay, that can happen. Nobody can deny that. But let's get going and see what shape up in the next few days. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. May I?
Thanks, Dr.
And,
Please go
okay,
ahead.
so I just want to add a little bit. It's I want you to to see that the Saturday summit, it can show something that we improve something that Myanmar allow us to involve in order to try and solve their domestic affairs. So I think it's a good start. So and what about we can do the ASEAN member can do right now? Actually, as I mentioned in my my slide PowerPoint, we can do in many other ways. Like we can do like a bilateral negotiation. Actually, all the member country can help like private talks, or maybe more pressure with political influence, something up like that. So let's see. Thank you.
I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to underscore the point that Pa Ong Keng Yong said just now. I think, if you think about it, throughout ASEAN's existence, there have been so many moments when its obituary have been written. There have been many moments when questions have been raised about ASEAN's relevance, ASEAN's contributions, and in the face of real problems, real challenges. But somehow ASEAN has demonstrated resilience and political tenacity and commitment to be able to manage the problems that it encounters in the region and comes out stronger. And I have confidence that likewise in this particular episode, ASEAN will demonstrate that same level of effort. Of course, it's easier said than done. It's not is not a given. Much hard work needs to be done, and patience, resilience, and commitment, perseverance. All those qualities are needed, and I'm sure that I'm hopeful and sure that the current leadership in ASEAN will deliver on that type of needs or requirement. What is helpful, what is useful at this time is that the broader geopolitical conditions that Pa Ong Keng Yong had mentioned beyond Southeast Asia, beyond ASEAN, actually wants ASEAN to contribute and play a role. This is not always the case. In some other regions, the major power rivalries are so intense and project their own proxy interests that the regional powers become sidelined. But in the case of ASEAN, I think based on its past record, there is a sense of goodwill and space being given to ASEAN. You can describe it as being pressure or expectation or even opportunity being given to ASEAN to deliver. And I think it is very important for ASEAN to be doing precisely that, as has been demonstrated by the summit, which is significant and overpromised. And I don't want to be belittling the summit's importance, because it has important 5 points that we can use as benchmark, as I said before. If I'm not mistaken, Vietnam is still currently a member of the UN Security Council in New York. Again, that provides ASEAN as another channel to communicate its regional level efforts to the United Nations level efforts. But there are, if I may, just some rather self-consumed ASEAN interests, procedural interests that ASEAN must try to manage. And I apologize to our Myanmar viewers if it seems to be too ASEAN consumed. But I think ASEAN must have a script in dealing, for instance, at the United Nations. There will be forthcoming meeting of the Credentials Committee before any United Nations General Assembly session, wherein the question of who represents Myanmar will come to the fore. It's a committee made up of member states, not all member states, but will be recommended to the General Assembly. ASEAN must have a common position on that. And this is not a uniquely ASEAN phenomenon. I remember in the past there was some debate, for instance, on the country of Afghanistan, who represents who at the UN. So ASEAN must have a consolidated view on that, so that it doesn't become full-blown ASEAN division in New York. Likewise, ASEAN is going to have a series of ASEAN foreign ministers level meeting, I assume, in June, July, or August. Would the presence of the junta at these meetings, what kind of dynamic and message would it send to our dialogue partners? I remember in the past, Pa Ong Keng Yong, we went through all these permutations. We as ASEAN 10, we stand solidly behind Myanmar at that time to say it's not for them to suggest whatever how we should be, but we have to have some kind of a modality in dealing with this issue. And to someone's point earlier about suspending or etc. Myanmar's membership, I'm not obviously a lawyer. I'm not obviously a legally trained on legal matters. But my recollection is that the ASEAN Charter doesn't actually provide, unlike, for instance, the Organization of African Unity and others, or the Commonwealth, for the suspension of a member because of lack of constitutional government. But in ASEAN, there is provision of that, if I'm not mistaken, in the Charter that requires evaluation in cases where the Charter is deemed to have been violated by a member state, and for it to be drawn to the attention of member states. Now, again, the importance of the Saturday meeting is that we are all on the same page now. As I said before, the junta in Myanmar cannot be allowed to wiggle out of their commitment. We have clear benchmark to measure progress or lack of progress. So if ASEAN member states feel the 5 points are not being implemented in weeks, months to come, and I get Pa Ong Keng Yong's point that we have to, this is a process, as I have said, we have to it's not patience, but we need to allow these developments to occur. But there must be some kind of to keep them honest, to keep the junta honest in terms of their commitment. And I think this is what the 5 point is. And meanwhile, in my view, in my personal view, it seems quite surreal, quite unacceptable to me to have any discussions involving the junta on any other issues to do with ASEAN. How can you talk with the representative of the junta on ASEAN community building, this and that, when the only issue that that we should be interacting with them is on the issue of the 5 points. Otherwise, it makes mockery, to have a representative of junta talking about ASEAN connectivity, etc., for instance, or ASEAN identity, etc., when people are being shot at. People are being shot at by a military that is supposed to defend the country, but they are shooting at their own citizens. I don't know. I can't imagine ASEAN sitting to talk about ASEAN community, ASEAN connectivity, etc. The only subject matter for the junta is the 5 points, and keep them on track on that. Thank you.
Yes, continue.
Can I say something, Tan Hui? Well,
Yes, please.
I have this to say. Very interesting, the point made by Pak Mati about ASEAN leaders. ASEAN Charter does not have provisions to suspend member. But ASEAN leaders, when they get together, they can decide to support Myanmar or not to support Myanmar. And that will happen in the final analysis. If given a certain period, if this 5 point consensus in the eyes of the current chair that Myanmar has not done so, Myanmar betrayed on its commitment, I am sure ASEAN leaders, ASEAN chair, particularly, I have to repeat, this ASEAN chair will decide that you are no longer, we will not give you any support. Now, what is the best thing that happened on Saturday is that ASEAN has established personal trust. They see eye to eye, they read each body language. I look at the pictures, I can see very serene, everybody sit quietly, and everybody set out the common view. And if that is the case, when there come a time to assess whether the military regime has done to fulfill its commitment or not on the 24th of April, and the decision that made will based on that. If ASEAN decided in the next meeting, hey, listen, Myanmar just fool us, then I think ASEAN will wait no time to go for a decisive decision. And that, I think, ASEAN always think of ways to engage with the so-called crisis. Look at the SAR. Remember the SAR? When we face that, leader come together, 2008, when there's a right crisis, shortage, ASEAN leader come together and find solution.
I wanted to make 2 points quickly. In the coverage of the discussion at the ASEAN Summit in Jakarta on Saturday, I think 2 things were not properly focused on. One, both the Tamado as well as the democratically elected parliamentarians, the NUG now they call it, National Unity Government, they both side support the 2008 Myanmar Constitution. Yeah, this is a bit different from all the other scenario elsewhere or even in the past, where one party contending for power reject a particular constitution or particular version of constitution. Now, both the contending group in Myanmar accepted that their legitimacy of action originated from the same Myanmar Constitution of 2008. Yeah, The Tamador say, according to the constitution, they have to protect the stability and security of the country. The democratic forces say that under the 2008 Myanmar constitution, they proceeded to take election, to do the election, and from that election, this is the outcome. Therefore, they are allowed to assume power. Okay, so how are we going to square this thing out? Basically, for an outsider, we are just scratching our head and say, both of you agree to the fundamental foundational basis of each of your claim to power. Then how? It's not like elsewhere where after a junta took over, they changed the constitution, they reorganized everything. Here, the fundamental basis is the state. Number two, you reference to Pak Mati's reference to the UN Credential Committee and all that. It's a very important point. And that's why our ASEAN process is a marvelous magic. If you look at all the statements made by all the ASEAN delegation in the summit on Saturday in Jakarta at the ASEAN Secretariat, no one addressed being online as the leader or the governmental power in charge in Myanmar. Every one of our participating ASEAN leaders and delegation regarded him as a commander of the Tamador, which, if we go back to both sides agreeing to the 2008 Myanmar constitution, it is still there. Nobody acknowledged that this is the leader of a new government. We call him general, we call him senior general, we call him, address him as commander-in-chief of Tamador. Nobody say you are the leader of the country called Myanmar. So I want to suggest that there are many things going on, and when we talk about all these principles and legality and all that, people tend to forget. If our envoy is going to go to Myanmar, we are going to be seized with this problem. Both sides say, I believe in the 2008 constitution. Then what's the problem? It's an interpretation of who is doing the right thing or not. Now, if there is no judge to say you did the right thing or not thing, how? Number two, I don't think ASEAN has any way, ASEAN member country has in any way recognized that the general in charge is the leader of a new Myanmar government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, to be fair, there has been a lot of debate about this 2008 constitution, and the anti-coup movement has been quite vocal about the rejection of the 2008 constitution. But I take your point that they do base their legitimacy on the charter. Well, let's move on to our next question from Grenville Hopkinson. How should we interpret the absence of the 3 ASEAN members during the summit? I think he meant the absence of the 3 heads of governments: Philippines, Thailand, and Laos. Would anyone like to tackle that question?
Yeah, well, I can explain the case of Thailand. I can explain it. It's very easy. I think our Prime Minister missed the opportunity to attend the summit, to touch base and meet face-to-face with other leaders. For the past 16 months, they haven't seen each other. But that doesn't mean that Thailand interest, Thailand roles in this crisis was not there. In fact, he was given the full mandate as a special envoy, and Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Don Paramatvinai was actually the key person who has been engaging in the Myanmar crisis since February 1st, contact directly with other ASEAN member and also the chair. And the reason why our prime minister didn't go there was uh, the uptick of the infection during the week preceding the summit, especially during the traditional New Year's. The number in the week ahead of the summit increased almost double for the past 6 months. So he thought that, it would be a political suicide indeed, because his job as a prime minister is to take care of foremost the health and life of the Thai person. So he decided not to attend the meeting, but he followed up. That's my answer to the question in the case of Thailand.
Can I add? Can I add? Okay, so in case that maybe it seemed like Thailand did not take much action in this case, but I actually like it seems like we try to protect some people say it like that. We try to protect Myanmar, but actually I want you to to know about that. Our country, I mean Myanmar and Thailand. So we very like close and we have a long history together, and also we have a strong business links. So this is very sensitive issue between Thai and Myanmar. But anyway, I think that we try to do something that if you can see that Kundon Pormatvinai, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he proposed something. He proposed about we call it D4D. D4D is for like de-escalating violence and delivery humanitarian assistance, discharge of detainees, and dialogue. So this is it's our Thailand propose about the way to try to say something to the Myanmar crisis. Thank you.
I want to say that to analyze the absence of 3 ASEAN leaders, as question was put to us, for being absent, my answer is that will their presence make a difference? Will there be a 8-point consensus rather than this 5-point consensus? So the important thing, we go back to the mandate. Each of the 3 leaders, representative at the meeting, wasn't the driver of the leader or his research officer. In the case of Thailand, it was the former UN ambassador who is the foreign minister as well as deputy prime minister. In the case of the Philippines, it was the foreign minister. In the case of Laos, it was also the foreign minister. And I'm sorry, I'm a bit biased here. As far as I'm concerned, in ASEAN, foreign ministers are very important because they are the overall. We have a saying, yeah, the foreign minister may be the basement of a building, because if they are not there, there is no first floor, second floor. Yeah. So I think, while I was quite initially disappointed that 3 of the leaders will not be able to attend, but the outcome, as I see it now, really, their absence, while regrettable, and for the reason that you have heard in the case of Thailand, I don't know about Laos and Philippines, but I think the outcome have been good, even with the absence of these 3 guys. Yeah. So I think we need not go and analyze what does this mean. Is it because they don't agree? I wish I can sit back and look at all the. Unfortunately, we were not privy to what actually been discussed. Actually, we in our old days, we used to have a little chart, a clipboard. We clip and say, point 1, 2, 3. Who said, who did not agree? And if I have a clipboard to analyze, what the respective leaders have said, it will be more or less they agree on these 5 points. Yeah, and also the particular point, I believe, because everyone told me, third-hand sources, of course, they have not recognized the general as the leader of a new government in Myanmar. They recognize him as the military leader. So I think maybe let us have some time to go over the outcome of the summit and really ask ourselves, is it a good thing to keep analyzing why 3 ASEAN leaders didn't turn up? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, having said that, the question about legitimacy and how these various ASEAN countries took certain steps not to recognize General Ling Lang as the representative of Myanmar. I mean, to be fair, there have been all these senior officials meetings in ASEAN that have been conducted by civil servants that are operating under the junta. So I guess in the next few weeks and months ahead, the question, like Dr. Marty said, will become thornier. Eventually, ASEAN would have to face that question: how and who it will recognize as the representative of Myanmar. We move on to the next question from Phil Robertson. This is a question to all panelists. Is there a way for ASEAN to insist on both a timeline and benchmarks for the implementation of the 5-point consensus? How can this be done, and what kind of timeline is reasonable? I think just now we heard something like 5 months, but I'm not sure. What do you think is a reasonable timeline?
Well, if I may, I did describe the 5 points before as of a benchmark of a sort. I mean, at least now post summit, there is a reference point to measure progress or lack of progress vis-a-vis Myanmar's development in Myanmar, the ending of the violence, the initiation of a dialogue, the Myanmar being open to the special envoy and the delegation and humanitarian assistance. So these are clear benchmark that the junta has also, notwithstanding the subsequent qualification, have also at the summit joined the consensus in, and therefore that's a very useful benchmark. I always hesitate in having publicly declared deadline or timeline because it's not, I know it may sound a bit unacceptable for when we have a situation where you need to have progress here and now, because whatever timeline one sets, whether it be 1 week, 10 days, 10 months, whatever, it is sort of like immediately has a built-in impression as if pending that we will tolerate whatever will happen, because actually we don't tolerate, because we don't want to have any delay, even 1 day delay, because 1 day means more casualties, more people being killed and being and suffering, and therefore the only relevant timeline is, if one is asked, must be immediately, has to be implemented. The consensus document, if I'm not mistaken, I stand to be corrected, I don't have it in front of me. In all of the 5 points, they use the term shall, not may, would, could, but shall. What it is a very determined, almost instruction, almost wishing this to happen right away. So I don't think it's useful to have any. By saying it's not useful to have a timeline, I'm not saying we will tolerate continued delay, but I think that timeline must be in the mind of the special envoy and the leaders of ASEAN in their private discussion. But to put it out there, I think will defeat the purpose, because immediately there is I mean, some parties may want to procrastinate, want to play out the process, but if any timeline must be given, to me, it has to be now. The whole thing, the 5 point, has to end right away. Has to be implemented right away. Ending of violence, but it's a process, as others have said. I'm only too aware that these things is not like a magic wand that you can have it immediately, but we must act with a sense of urgency. And I did suggest just now two things that I feel are a little bit important at the moment. One is to consolidate communication with the democratic forces, the democratically elected leaders, because they have not been post-summit. I mean, the summit was like a red carpet, literally, for the junta. Now, surely the democratically elected leaders, the national unity government, is deserving of some kind of a open public interaction. It doesn't have to be with all ASEAN 10. It could be in the presence of the chair of ASEAN on behalf of all, or the Secretary General to convey the results of the chair of the summit. But it is important to put it out there. And the second point on measuring the violence progress or lack of progress. The ASEAN Secretariat can set up a desk. I know it sounds so minimalistic, that basically you have a monitoring team now. You have a monitoring team based on public reports, all the reports that we receive from various quarters. What are the casualty figures? Who is being held? Not only numbers, but who perpetrated these things? Some of these perpetration of violence are being seen, real. You can see the faces of these people must not be allowed. There must not be impunity. Responsibility to protect doesn't simply mean intervention. It's a responsibility of the state concerned to protect. So when we say responsibility to protect, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be gung-ho UN Security Council Charter mandated force to come in and interfere, force an outcome. It is consistent with sovereignty. That's why we use the term responsibility to protect. That is what all of us worked on in the UN before. Hence, I remember the late Surin Pisuan, our Secretary General of ASEAN, spoke eloquently on this point as well, how responsibility to protect and ASEAN community goes hand in hand. It is as good as an ASEAN principle. We've been speaking about people-centered ASEAN. How more people can you be? If you have people being shot, is that a people-centered ASEAN? I don't think so. But again, once again, the summit provides a potential solution, a potential roadmap. We are better today than we were last week. At least we have a script, and ASEAN has come forward. And ASEAN deserves support by the international community and by all of us. Thank you.
I want to say, if I'm a Myanmar military leader, I have a timeline. Okay, the timeline is how long Aung San Suu Kyi is going to be alive. Because if you look at the country, who else can rally the kind of numbers that allow Myanmar to develop in the last 10 years? Yeah. Mind you, she wasn't yet successful. She isn't successful in bringing every ethnic group into the fold. But every military strategist in the Commodore knows, yeah, she is able to keep the union of Myanmar according to what the soldiers have sworn as the union of Myanmar. So if they continue to keep her in detention, her health deteriorate, yeah, I don't think it's going to be good for the longer plans, a longer term strategy of the Myanmar Commodore. If Commodore really believe in their commitment to the 2008 constitution to uphold the security, stability, and well-being of the country called Union of Myanmar, they have a timeline. they cannot afford to carry on the way it has been exhibited in the last few months. Yeah, without Aung San Suu Kyi, the case at the ICJ would have gone the other way. Yeah, and what will happen to the country? The country will be further divided and further broken up. So if you are a thinking general or thinking soldier, you have a timeline. Yeah, and there are nobody else. If you look around the whole Myanmar diaspora and even in the country, up till today, no one has told me there is another person of that stature to bring together all these forces to give a modicum of statehood to a country called Union of Myanmar. Thank you.
Um, okay, so in my opinion, I think that the 5-point consensus is like I said, I mentioned already is no time frame. Like, but anyway, the first priority, I think what they should do is now like stop violence, and also another thing is the humanitarian assistance is very important right now. And anyway, the 5-point consensus, I think it's like it's not the process like to do step by step. It's no need to do that. Actually, they can do like at the same time. So I think if we talk about time frame right now, so maybe I'm worried it's too late to help people in Myanmar country. Thank you.
Kun Kawi, would you like to add anything about how long
Oh no,
this should take?
no, nothing.
Okay, sure. We have time for one last question for tonight. This is from Leah Skiltino from C Junction. Shouldn't the main benchmark be to free the prisoners? Why was this not included at the last moment in the consensus? And shouldn't it be included before any dialogue starts? How can dialogue happen when those who should be in the dialogue are instead in jail?
I think that's a
That's
good point. That's a good point. Let me offer my comments and then Mati maybe can join and the rest can join. The way I learned about ASEAN documentation is that you look from page one to the last page. Okay. In some cases, they have the main document and then they have annexes. Yeah. Sometimes critical points were put in the annexes and not in the main document. At other time, critical point were put in the main document but not in the annexes. So when I saw that the 5-point consensus did not cover the release of political prisoners, as some of the leaders have advocated, in my case, my prime minister, he himself, as well as my foreign minister, has said, we work for the release of political prisoners. And then when I saw the 5-point, I didn't see the release of political prisoners. So I went back to the original main document, yeah, the long story that precedes the 5 points. And there was an acknowledgement there, I think paragraph 8 or something. This is an open document now, you can actually look at it, yeah, where they say ASEAN leaders, some ASEAN leader or something to the effect that some of the leaders present stress the need for dialogue, involvement of all parties, and as for therefore necessary to have the release of political prisoners. So as far as, say, if I'm in Singapore, my concern is that I have raised this point, but it was not in the final 5-point consensus agreement, maybe because if I am Myanmar, I agree to this 5 point, but if you put there release of political prisoner, hey, Pak Mati and Kavi will know. Immediate action. I have to release tomorrow. And if I don't release, that means I fail to comply with the 5-point or the 6-point agreement. So I think there is a bit of maneuver here. Yeah. But at the end of the day, for the majority of the ASEAN countries, at least from the media statement made by all the leaders, including the Prime Minister of uh, Thailand, I think he also advocates release of political prisoner, although he's not there. Yeah. So it is true. If we want to be credible, we cannot go and negotiate without all parties who happen to be in jail being present. So these are something very important, and I think going forward, our friends in the media ought to look at this particular point, and this is where media can help. If we are credible, we want to have a participation by all stakeholders. That means we have to look at the release of some of these guys. From my own experience, yeah, in the early years, Pamati, when in the 2000, late 2000, early 2000, when we had to deal with a boycott of Myanmar by other countries, yeah, the participation of some of the NLD people in the open was very important because they could make a statement carried by the media, yeah. But if they are all behind bar, then their position will not be known to all of us, and it will not be they will not be able to gain the kind of mileage or the kind of support that they have obtained during that period. So for now, release of political prisoners is an important point, at least for me. And if we are sincere about having more participation by all the stakeholders, this particular element should be pursued in a more concerted way. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone have anything else to add on this question of political prisoners?
Just may I say something, Huey? I underscore the point that Pa Ong Keng Yong had said. A document of this type produced by ASEAN is always a product of very complex negotiations and discussions, crafted in a way that in a way that can carry consensus. And there must be a reason as to why the reference to the heard calls for the release of political prisoners was placed not amongst the 5 consensus points, but rather in the body of the chairman's statement accompanying or prefacing the 5-point principles. There must have been a reason. It must have been a delicate balance of how one can have it expressed in a way that can still maintain a consensus. While words matter, and of course statements matter, but I think the principal importance is that the clarion call for the release of not only so-called political prisoners, but actually democratically elected leaders. This is imagine they just had an election. They just had an election that was monitored and for all purposes deemed to be sound in its proceedings, and then just on the eve of the parliamentarians being appointed, they were arrested. So, and to Pa Ong Keng Yong's point, how can one have a dialogue amongst all stakeholders when these stakeholders are behind bars, and it just it doesn't make sense. And therefore, I would like to think that the requirement for the release of political prisoners, aside from being mentioned in the main body of the chairman's statement, is inherent in the second point of the chairman's the consensus point, namely an all-inclusive dialogue, wherein it must be inherent that the release of political prisoners must take place. And I'm glad, as Pa Ong Keng Yong had said, I think all quite a few of the ASEAN leaders have been quite vociferous and quite persistent in airing this point, and I think that we must all echo that point. Hence, my original point, I think it is extremely important, critically important for ASEAN in the days to come, and this is where I'd like to put a timeline. I'm generally hesitant, but on this issue of reaching out to the other side, so-called other side, the democratically elected leaders, the NUG, the civil disobedience movement, the other stakeholders, ASEAN must be seen in the days to come to be communicating with them as well. Otherwise, the last word, the last image is as if it is the junta that's being conferred the red carpet treatment. I know, to Pa Ong Keng Yong's point, yes, none of ASEAN member states suggest they have conferred recognition, and they have been extremely nuanced and smart in the language that they use to avoid a suggestion of conferment of recognition. But this is an issue that will confront ASEAN in other forums. It's not only an ASEAN level issue, it will soon be brought within ASEAN whenever others wants to come, at the United Nations. So ASEAN must have a script on how to demonstrate their non-conferment of recognition in these other forums. Otherwise, we will be, ASEAN will have difficulties. But again, it is not the issue at hand. While we are talking about ASEAN, the real issue at hand and must be central to our attention is Myanmar. Is the crisis in Myanmar. All of us in this process discussion, we all wish to see ASEAN do well, but solutions, we have to be open-minded to different ways and means to find a solution. Of course, ASEAN centrality, etc., is the preferred mode for many of us, but it shouldn't be solution looking for a problem. We have to identify what is the nature of the problem and find the appropriate solution. It could be ASEAN, it could be some other solution, but ASEAN certainly has stepped up to the plate, and the leaders must be commended for that. Thank you.
Well, I just have a little to add. I think in ASEAN document, inclusive dialogue, taking into considerations the release of political prisoner, which I think not only 3 or 4, but the consensus by all other ASEAN countries, even though it did not specifically spelled out. And I think one thing that we have to mention is the comfort level between the Myanmar stakeholder, in this case, the Tatmadaws and the elected MP, or the political prisoner, or for that matter, those who have been arrested. Journalists include doctors, professionals, people, and all that. So I think the next step is to make sure that the comfort levels among Myanmar concerning party find suitable sort of a platform so that they can talk. What comes first? To answer a few questions is that timeline can be double-edged sword because it can create false expectation by all parties, which cannot be met realistically. But one thing that must be expected, and all of us agree, is that immediate cessation of violence. And I think this will need to be confirmed and really work on it before any other solid step can be done. For example, assessments, scooping for real situations on the humanitarian assistance and other things. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Dr. Prapi, would you like to add anything?
Oh, no. It's okay.
Okay. Thank you. Well, very thought-provoking comments. I take your point that although the release of political prisoners was not explicitly mentioned in the 5-point consensus, it was implicit in the point about having an inclusive dialogue among all stakeholders. And it's interesting because Several representatives of the National Unity Government have already stated that they are ready to engage ASEAN and the special envoy that ASEAN is going to appoint. So that's something positive, and that's a space to look at. Well, the situation in Myanmar is unfolding as we speak, and it will take some time before any form of resolution takes shape. So, did ASEAN make a strategic compromise with the junta to get its foot in the door? Or, will this turn out to be another measure used by the junta to buy time? Well, the jury is still out, but that's all we have for our discussion today. If you like what we have been doing and would like to support these public service live streams, please consider taking up an FCCT membership or making a donation. You can find the details on our Facebook account. Once again, thank you to all our panelists and viewers out there, and to our friends in Myanmar. Keep strong and stay safe. Thank you, everybody, and have a very good night.